Hello and welcome to The Last Word. Today is Vinod Rai's last day as Controller and Auditor General. So tonight we look back on his tenure and ask, has he transformed the institution he leaves behind? That's with former CAG T.N. Chaturvedi, former Cabinet Secretary T.S.R. Subramanian, former Finance Secretary Ashok Jha, and the Managing Editor of the Financial Express, Sunil Jain. Gentlemen, let's start with the big picture. Mr. Chaturvedi, as a former CAG, how do you evaluate Vinod Rai's performance as CAG? How does he compare with his predecessors?
I think he has carried on the tradition of his predecessors, and he has acquitted himself extremely well. He has tried to carry out his mandate as is enshrined in the Constitution without fear or favor. And because of the media and the press and the great public scrutiny in which now the public is interested so far as the government expenditure is concerned, naturally his reports have got much wider publicity. But he has tried to do his duty and has done it very well. He has strengthened the institution of the CAG.
Okay.
He has enriched it by the some of the steps that he has taken.
Now, Mr. Subramanian, there is a view that Vinod Rai has done to the office of the CAG what T.N. Seshan did to the office of the CEC. Seshan transformed the CEC and raised it to an altogether higher level. Do you believe Vinod Rai has done precisely that to the CEC?
Yes, I am firmly of that view. Before Seshan, there were excellent CECs. Before Vinod Rai, there were excellent CAGs, including the person in your panel. But the full constitutional mandate of the CAG as a servant not of the Crown, not as a government department, but as an adversary and critic of government expenditure, that dimension was fully brought into focus sharply by Vinod Rai. I do believe he has transformed it. I also believe we need one more session to remove money power elections. We also need successive CAGs to maintain and build on the platform created by Vinod Rai.
Ashok Jha, some people say that what Mr. Rai did was to also make the office of the CAG deeply controversial, at least as far as the UPA and perhaps in particular the Congress were concerned. Was that inevitable, or could it have been handled more discreetly and with less controversy?
Well, thanks, Karan, for giving me this opportunity. I think at the outset I must make a small disclosure. The disclosure is that Vinod and I worked very closely together in the Finance Ministry, and therefore it is possible that whatever I say may have an element of bias in it. Now, coming to the question that you have just asked me, I think Vinod has done an excellent job as far as CAG is concerned in terms of demystifying the office of CAG.
But what about,
earlier
can I stop you? I asked you a specific question, come to that please. Could he have handled the relationship that's brought him into controversy with the UPA more discreetly?
No, I am not quite sure what you mean by more discreetly. See, to answer your question, I was leading up to it before you interrupted me. So if you allow me, I will try and answer your question.
Go ahead.
Okay. You see, as I said, he's done a fantastic job in terms of trying to demystify the CAG's office. CAG reports are no longer within the domain of the government and the Parliament or the PAC. It is now there very much in public domain. I think the other thing that he has done remarkably well is to put corruption at the center of the debate.
Okay.
But I think where I do not agree with what he has done is in terms of basically foraying into government policy domain. You see, just as the judiciary should not really get into the policy making of the government, I strongly believe that the CAG's mandate stops when we are looking at the policies made by the government.
In other words, you're saying he exceeded his remit by stepping into areas where he should have not been there at all?
Exactly, that is what I am saying. As far as policy making is
Okay.
concerned, it is entirely the domain of the government, and it should be left to the within the domains of the government.
Sunil Jain, let's come to some of Mr. Rai's specific reports, and let's begin with 2G. Was he right to calculate loss on the grounds that spectrum had not been auctioned, and therefore there had to be a loss, although you could debate whether it was small or large? Or was he wrong to overlook the government's viewpoint that revenue maximization was not the intention, that the real aim was to extend services to hundreds of millions who otherwise would not have had access to affordable phones for generations?
Fair enough. In fact, this, I've got to apologize, I've got a very bad throat. This takes us to Ashok Jha's point when he's saying that the CAG got into areas he shouldn't have got into. So the point is that was there a policy of the government of India which said that we would auction spectrum? There was. When the BJP was in power, when the licenses were given, the licenses were given to the Ambanis and the Tatas, then there's a cabinet resolution which said that all spectrum in future would be auctioned.
Quite right, so you're talking about 31 October 2003, but then wasn't there a TRAI recommendation that came in 2007 which advised the government quite differently?
It is a recommendation. So the cabinet resolution, as it were, which is the only policy at that time, said that you must have an auction. So what did Vinod Rai do? He did two things. He said, this is a policy. But the point is not whether I mean, as Ashok
Except
said,
for the fact that cabinet resolution you're talking about was also ignored by BJP ministers themselves. Within weeks of it being passed, Arun Shourie overturned it.
No, I'm not saying that the CAG, has not. I mean, the CAG should have looked at the BJP. That's a different matter.
So are you suggesting that this is a transgression into the domain of policy that is justified?
I think it was policy. The policy was that you would auction.
The government, of course, questions and disputes that, but you're saying that his interpretation of policy is different to the government.
Karan, let's put it this way. The government auctioned 3G. The government is auctioning now.
But the two are different things.
No, why
there was a decision taken at a different time. The government has a right to change policy. The question that Mr. Jha was raising, which I was asking you, was the CAG under Mr. Vinod Rai correct in entering the area of policy? You're saying he was.
I'm saying he was, and I'm saying he is legally right. I'm saying he should have, and secondly, he was legally entitled to do it.
Let me put it like this, Mr. Chaturvedi. In calculating loss on the grounds that spectrum was not auctioned, many people believe that Mr. Rai failed to take into account revenue that would be earned by the whopping increase in teledensity and the huge increase in the number of users. Teledensity went up from 24% in 2008 to 73% today. The number of users went up from 234 million to 893 million today. And all of that, as TK Arun of the Economic Times calculated, added in tax revenue terms a further 1 lakh crore a year, which suggests that in just 2 years, the 1.76 lakh presumptive loss would have been more than wiped out. Yet it seems the CAG, in presenting that presumptive loss figure, left out the balancing side that the new revenues coming in would have wiped it out in 2 years. Now, was he right to do that?
I'm not sure whether he really missed this particular point that you have just mentioned. It is very likely he might have taken that into account. This is another question that arises, is that did the government bring this to the notice when the draft reports are set and at different levels they are examined, and if the CAG's comment was about the loss, then did the government clarify this particular position, that these are the different ways in which we are trying to compensate for what might have been lost earlier in the auction itself.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point you raise. That's a very good point you raise, and I will point out for the sake of the audience that this balancing factor was brought to public attention by TK Arun in the Economic Times. As far as I know and as far as I remember, at no point of time has any government minister himself made this point in the government's defense. On the other hand, Mr. Subramaniam, an argument the government has made is that if governments can choose to sell utilities like water and power below their market price, or food through ration shops at a heavily subsidized price without the CAG calculating loss, why can't governments sell spectrum cheaply to facilitate cheap phones without being accused of losing money? If one policy is right, how can the other be wrong?
Karan, we can discuss the details of the 2G issue for the next 24 hours. The issue here is, did the CAG exceed his brief? Has he told the government what to do? What he has done merely is that what government did, he analyzed it like a good auditor. He said, you did A, these are the consequences. If you did B, this would have been the consequences. It is up to you. You are the owner. I don't think he interfered with, he has no right to interfere, he has no locus standi interfering with policy at all.
Okay.
There is no question of his entering into policy territory. He is not meant for that. He had only commented on the financial consequences. Government has to say, yes, we took it with our eyes open, we did it deliberately. Fair enough. It is for government, it's like a good auditor pointing out to the board and to the general body, it is for the board and general body to decide. Don't shoot the messenger.
Mr. Jha, let's pursue this point about whether the CAG under Vinod Rai exceeded its brief or not, which is a point that you actually made in your first answer, with reference this time to Colgate. Here, Mr. Rai calculated a loss of 1.86 lakh crore incurred by the Exchequer because the government delayed implementing its own decision to auction by 8 years. But doesn't that mean that the CAG audited the cost of the delay in changing policy and not the policy itself? And the two are very different things, and arguably the first is not part of his remit at all.
You see, firstly, of course, here the CAG is not talking about a loss. Here he is talking about gain to private parties which accrued because of the policy.
But that translates into loss to the treasury.
Yeah. Well, if you can look at it that way, but I would look at it in a slightly different angle. However, that's not the main point. The main point is that if the government does not take a particular policy decision, say in the year 2008, and takes it in the year 2013, can anybody find fault with it?
Absolutely.
There are so many policies like what you mentioned a few minutes ago. Say the government is giving subsidized cooking gas to everybody.
Can I stop you there? I want to pull out for the benefit of the audience the underlying thought behind the point you made. If the government doesn't take a policy decision for 6 years and there's a 6-year delay, can you blame the government for it, and then should you be auditing on that basis? Are you therefore going to suggest that this is a clear instance of the CAG exceeding his brief?
What I am trying to say is exactly the point you made a few minutes ago, that the government is subsidizing things like cooking gas, water, electricity and so on. Now, on cooking gas, only recently the government has decided that it will only be partly subsidized. So can somebody stand up and say that why did you not take this decision of either removing subsidy or partially removing subsidy for so many years, and therefore this is you have caused loss to the government?
Absolutely. So
is that a correct standpoint?
In fact, what you're therefore suggesting is that by doing an audit on that basis, the CAG under Mr. Vinod Rai exceeded his brief. Am I correct in coming to that conclusion? Give me a quick yes or no.
I will not give you a quick yes or no, but I will say this is exactly what I have been saying, that in terms of interference in policy, just as the judiciary should keep out of the domain of policy making, so should CAG and other constitutional functionaries.
All right,
policy making is entirely the domain of the government.
Forgive me, I'm going to decode that answer for the audience, and I think that is bureaucracies for a clear yes disguised in a somewhat long-winded statement. Let me put it like this. You've had once again from Mr. Ashok Jha a clear example where the CAG under Vinod Rai exceeded its brief. In this instance, he's actually audited the cost to the Exchequer of a government failing to take a policy decision for 8 years. Now, that's not his remit. Governments fail to take lots of decisions, that's bad governance, and voters should vote them out for it. But auditors shouldn't come in and work out the cost of failing to take a decision for 8 years. Yet that is exactly, in the Colgate case, what Mr. Rai did.
Yeah, firstly, just a couple of quick points. One, I don't know where TK Arun got his numbers from, because the government never got 1 lakh crores of license fee from these people, from the players that he gave licenses to.
So the figures themselves are questionable.
His question, they were completely wrong. And now, just to get to this question that you've been raising about you give LPG free or you give food free, why can't you give spectrum free? The reason why they're two very different things is that spectrum is being bought by a few people who are willing to pay more. Sunil Mittal is willing to pay a lot more. Other people are willing to pay.
Except that
So-
if they pay more, they will charge more for the facilities,
They-
so you won't make phones available cheaply to the population. Whereas if they pay less, the teledensity will increase, more subscribers will come in, and that gives a benefit to people who otherwise won't have it.
One sec, Karan. After these guys paid a king's ransom for the 3G spectrum, the prices never went up. Prices are
But
dictated.
3G hasn't rolled out either.
No, they haven't. The fact is that they paid.
3G is stuck because companies are
Karan-
broke because they paid too much.
Current, they paid the money, but they never raised the tariff. That's the point I'm making. You can't equate the two. But to get your question, that did Vinod Rai exceed his remit? Here's my counter question to you. And
No,
to
answer
Ashok-
my question.
I can only answer to the question. Here's my question to you and to Ashok Jha, that if Vinod Rai cannot question this, if the Chief Justice cannot question it, then what you're saying is the government of the day can give anything it wants at any price to anyone. I don't think
I'm
that's
not
fair.
sure if that necessarily follows, but I'll take a break at that point and leave it as a thought for the audience to think about. We often say that judges, when they indulge in what we call judicial activism, exceed their remit. And we don't say that that's acceptable, except by arguing that if the government doesn't act, someone has to step in and do it. But in this instance, does that argument apply to the CAG? Can the CAG do an audit on the basis that a decision was delayed by 8 years? Because that could apply to so many areas where governments fail to take decisions in time. That's bad governance, but is it good auditing? We'll take a break and come back and ask, what sort of successor will Mr. Rai have, and what sort of CAG will he give us? Welcome back to the last word. We're discussing Vinod Rai's legacy as CAG, and the question now that I want to put to Mr. Chaturvedi is, could it be in danger with his successor? After all, his successor is the former Defence Secretary Shashikant Sharma, and an article in today's Hindu points out that because Defence Ministry procurements are a major part of what the CAG audits, Mr. Sharma could find himself auditing expenditures that he authorized either as Defence Secretary or as Director General Acquisitions. Would that create a conflict of interest, Mr. Chaturvedi?
Mr. Karan Thapar, I'd like to preface my statement first by what was referred earlier as the straying of CAG, Vinod Rai in the coal gate. He was commenting on the actually the implementation of the policy and the failure of the bureaucracy and the failure in overseeing why
Okay.
that policy was not implemented earlier.
I take
That's
that-
it.
I take
Now,
that
coming
point, sir.
straight to your
Yep, come to my new point.
coming straight to your question of conflict of interest. I have also seen this morning the Hindu and some other papers also mentioned about it, but I think it is for the Shashikant Sharma to be a little bit more cautious.
Okay.
See to it that the cases with which he was directly concerned, he does not himself look into it and leaves it to his deputies and others and come with the
Okay.
decisions, and that's all he can do.
In
But,
other-
I mean, ostensibly it may look as a conflict of interest, but then it is how he sails through this thicket of the purchases and so on and so forth, and how he
Okay.
acquits himself, that probably will have to be watched.
All right, clearly
And
the,
I think he should
clearly the
do it very
onus
well.
is on Mr. Shashikant Sharma to be discreet and to ensure that he recuses himself in areas where there could be a conflict of interest. But do you think this raises a wider question, that given that so much of the work the CAG does is to audit governments of the day, do we need to ensure that they're not appointed by the government but by a collegium that comprises the opposition as well as perhaps other parties?
Absolutely, they should be appointed by a collegium, and more important, it should not be left to just former bureaucrats or people like that to be the CAG.
Very
Widen the
quickly,
scope.
Mr. Subramaniam, because we're right out of time. Do you think the time has come to rethink how CAGs are appointed so conflicts of interest are avoided? You have to answer with just a yes or a no because we're out of time.
I think so. All constitutional sensitive posts should now be by collegium, by consensus. We need to change the system. And incidentally, Karan, I think you should debate Vinod Rai and not Manish Tiwari. You'll do a better job.
Thank you very much indeed. I take that as a compliment and I hope Mr. Rai is listening to you. My apologies, Mr. Jha, we've run right out of time. I do apologize. But my thanks to all four of my guests for joining me. Goodbye. Good night.